This is Ed Robinson. We'll be discussing today C# classes. Well, we have here a class. This is a class enclosed with the curly braces. Essentially, a class consists of private data and public functions which act upon that data. Let's see how that works. The class is very similar to a structure which we've come across. Indeed, we could actually change the name of that to a class. The big difference is that we make our data private. Now, that might sound a bit strange, because if we have created a new instance or object, as we did for our structure, then if we tried to access the data, then it would cause an error, because the data is private. It's private to the class, and so it's no longer possible to access using that dot operator. That data, we could say, is encapsulated. Well, then you might say, well, how on earth are we going to access our data? And the answer is by means of these public functions. So we have some functions which can both set the data and get the data. And how do we access this data from main? Then we can call these functions. Here's the set data function being called, and here's the get data function being called. In the case of set data, you pass a value of 1 to this value here, the n, and you set indirectly the value of I, which is internal to the class. When you get the data, you can call this get data function, and that returns the internal variable, if you like, the private data. So this is the essentials of a class. A class contains private data and public functions which can access that data. Now, I must say this set data is not what we use in practice. We use a special function called a constructor, but we'll return to that. When we place these methods inside a class, when we place these functions inside a class, we then call them methods. So we need to get used to calling them methods when they're inside a class. And you can see that we use an object to call that method and calling the get data. I rather liken this to the Trojan horse story, where the horse was brought into Troy and had lots of soldiers inside, and they jumped out and had access to the city of Troy. I rather think of this as our Trojan horse. Whether this is the Trojan horse, the functions gain access to the city and therefore gain access to the private data inside the city. Maybe you need a bit of imagination for that, but that's one way of looking at it. Now, all of this looks a bit abstract, so you might be wondering how on earth we would use this and why we'd want to do what we're doing. So I think we need to show a practical explanation for this. And to do that, we need to consider how programs are built, indeed how they are compiled. How to use code from one program in another? Well, one method is to cut and paste. So, for example, as we all know, we've seen this before, you can take the source code of one program and put it in another program. But another method is to reuse executable or compiled code using a class. Let's see what we mean by that. So the other method is to reuse executable code. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, essentially we're going to split our program up into 2 bits. We're going to have this bit here, we're going to compile it separately. Then when we've done that, we're going to, well, let's say that's compiled and sent away, and then we're going to have a separate program which is going to access this compiled code somewhere or other. Now, how do we access that? Well, we actually set a reference to it. So we'll say project and then add a reference which is here, and we should then be able to access our compiled code. So you see, a class is a convenient way of having our data and our functions contained in a unit, in this unit called a class. When you think about it, what is a computer program? What does it have? A computer program will have data and will have functions which act upon that data. So you could therefore say that a class does mimic that. So in the next video, I'm going to show you how to compile this bit of code here, the class, and tuck it away, and then make another program containing this which will access that compiled code.